The vampire king's daughter had never spoken a single word in 300 years, until the black maid pressed her palm to the child's throat and whispered a phrase in a language the court had tried to erase. The princess screamed her first sound, and every mirror in the palace shattered. What no one knew, the maid's bloodline carried the one curse that could break vampire silence, and now she's the king's most dangerous prisoner. Ayanna had exactly 3 hours of sleep when the palace carriage arrived at her door, black lacquer gleaming under street lamps like a beetle's shell, and she climbed in with her cleaning supplies and a sick twist in her stomach that had nothing to do with the motion of the wheels on cobblestone. Her younger brother Malik was dying. The doctors said 6 months without the treatment, maybe 8 if they were lucky, and the treatment cost more than she'd make in 5 years scrubbing floors at the textile mill. So when the recruitment notice appeared on the job board at the market, white parchment sealed with red wax that smelled faintly of copper, she didn't ask questions. She ripped off the bottom tab with the address and showed up at the hiring office in the warehouse district, where a woman with ink-black eyes and skin like porcelain looked her up and down once and said the job paid triple human wages, room and board included, and all she had to do was clean the north wing and keep her mouth shut about what she saw. Ayanna signed the contract in her own blood, because that was how vampire households did things, and she told herself it was just a cleaning job, just 12 months of mopping marble and polishing silver, and then Malik would be well and she could go back to her real life. The palace rose out of the mist like a crown of thorns, all spires and sharp angles, windows dark except for the occasional flicker of candlelight that moved too slow to be flame and too fast to be human. The head housekeeper met her at the servants' entrance, a thin vampire woman named Margot, who smelled like lavender and old paper, and she handed Ayanna a ring of iron keys and a list of rules printed in careful script. Rule 1 was to never enter the North Tower. Rule 2 was to never speak to the vampire king unless spoken to first. Rule 3 was to never touch anything in the family wing without gloves. Margot walked her through the lower halls, past tapestries thick with dust and suits of armor that gleamed in the gaslight. And Ayanna tried to memorize the turns, but everything looked the same: stone and shadow, and the faint smell of blood wine seeping from under closed doors. Margot left her in the scullery with a bucket and a mop and a curt nod, and Ayanna started on the tiles, working in steady rhythm the way her grandmother taught her, hum low in her throat to keep time. That was when she heard it. Crying, thin and high and desperate, barely audible over the scrape of bristles on stone, but unmistakable. A child. Ayanna froze with the mop halfway across the floor, water pooling around her boots. The sound came from above, from the direction Margot had specifically pointed to and said never, and Ayanna felt her grandmother's voice in the back of her mind. The same voice that used to tell her stories about the old country and magic that lived in words and the danger of ignoring a cry for help. She left the bucket. She followed the sound up a narrow servant's stair that spiraled into darkness, her palm sliding along the cold stone wall, counting steps to keep her breathing steady. 52 steps. A door at the top, unlocked. She pushed it open. The North Tower room was pristine in the way of places no one lived in, velvet curtains drawn tight against the moonlight, toys arranged in perfect rows on shelves that had never been touched. A rocking horse sat frozen mid-gallop. A porcelain doll stared from a chair with empty glass eyes. And in the center of the room, on a cushion embroidered with silver thread, sat a little girl, 7 years old maybe, pale as milk, hair like spun frost. Hollow eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. She wore a white dress that might have been a nightgown or a burial shroud, and when she saw Ayanna in the doorway she went completely still. Then she moved. Fast. Desperate. Hands flying to her throat, mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air, tears streaming down her cheeks. No sound came out. Ayanna crossed the room without thinking, her training as an older sister overriding every rule Margot had recited, and she knelt in front of the child and reached for her. The girl flinched. Ayanna waited. Slowly, the girl leaned forward and pressed her forehead to Ayanna's collarbone, tiny hands clutching at her apron, and Ayanna felt the silent sobs shaking through that small body like an earthquake trapped under skin. She had no idea what to do. She was a maid, not a healer, not a mother, just a woman trying to save her brother by cleaning floors for monsters. But her grandmother's voice rose in her memory again, the phrase she'd made Ayanna memorize when she was 6 years old, syllables in Yoruba that meant nothing to Ayanna then, and barely more now, except her grandmother had grabbed her by both shoulders and said, "If you ever meet someone who cannot speak, say these words and press your hand here," and she touched Ayanna's throat. So Ayanna did it. She pressed her palm to the girl's neck, feeling the rapid flutter of a pulse that was too slow for human and too fast for vampire, and she whispered the phrase her grandmother taught her. The words tasted like thunder. The girl's eyes went wide, her mouth opened, and she screamed. It was the first sound she'd made in 300 years, and it tore out of her like a dam breaking, raw and wordless, and so loud the air itself seemed to shatter. Ayanna felt the scream in her bones, in her teeth, in the marrow of her spine, and then the mirrors exploded. Every single one. The tall standing mirror in the corner, the hand mirror on the vanity, the tiny compact on the shelf. They burst outward in perfect synchronization, glass raining down in slow motion, each shard catching the gaslight and spinning like 1,000 tiny stars falling. Ayanna threw herself over the girl, shielding her with her body, and felt the sting of glass cutting through her apron and into her shoulders. The girl kept screaming. Footsteps thundered up the stairs. The door slammed open and guards poured in. 5 of them in black armor with red crests on their chests, and they moved with the terrible efficiency of soldiers who'd done this 1,000 times. 2 grabbed Ayanna by the arms and hauled her up, and she didn't fight because fighting vampires was suicide, and because the girl had stopped screaming and was staring at her with huge, wet eyes full of wonder and terror. One guard, older than the others with a scar across his jaw, looked at Ayanna like she was a bomb that hadn't finished exploding. He leaned close and whispered, his breath cold against her ear. "The Vampire King will smell the old magic on you now." Another guard, younger, angrier, yanked her toward the door. "You should not have touched her. No one touches her." Ayanna found her voice, thin and shaking. She was hurting. The guard's grip tightened hard enough to bruise. "She has been hurting for 300 years. You just made it everyone's problem." They dragged her down the spiral stairs, her boots skidding on stone, and Ayanna looked back once to see the girl standing in the doorway of her tower, glass glittering in her hair like a crown, and her lips were moving but no sound came out, and Ayanna realized with a sick lurch that the scream had been everything the girl had saved up for 3 centuries, and now she was empty again. The guards pulled her into a corridor that smelled like old stone and blood wine, and Ayanna's last thought before they shoved her into a cell beneath the throne room was that Malik would die now because she couldn't keep her hands to herself, couldn't ignore a child's cry, couldn't stop being the kind of person her grandmother raised her to be, even when it killed her. The holding cell was carved from black stone that wept moisture in thin rivulets, and Ayanna sat on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the guards outside discuss her execution like they were planning a menu. The first guard, the one with the scar, said the Court of Mirrors would convene at dawn, and that was 4 hours away, maybe 5 if the king was feeling merciful. The second guard laughed and said King Constantine hadn't felt merciful since his wife died, birthing that silent freak in the tower, and Ayanna's stomach clenched because she understood now that the girl was the princess, the heir, the one thing standing between this kingdom and chaos. The guards moved on, and Ayanna was alone with the sound of water dripping and her own ragged breathing. And she thought about Malik in his hospital bed with tubes in his arms and machines beeping his heartbeat, and how he'd asked her before she left if she was scared of working for vampires, and she'd lied and said no. The door opened 2 hours before dawn. A man stepped in, tall and slim, with silver hair pulled back in a tail and eyes like chips of ice, and he moved with the fluid grace of something that had never been human. He wore black velvet and rings on every finger, and when he spoke, his voice was silk over razors. "My name is Victor. I am the king's advisor. You are going to die unless you make yourself useful." Ayanna stood because sitting felt like surrender, and she met his eyes even though her grandmother had warned her never to meet a vampire's gaze directly. Victor smiled. He said the king had summoned the Court of Mirrors, which was the council of noble houses that advised the crown on matters of blood law and ancient magic, and they would want to know how a human maid broke a curse that had stumped the kingdom's best sorcerers for 3 centuries. He said she had 2 choices. The first was to confess everything, submit to blood questioning where 3 vampires would drink from her until they could read her memories, and then be executed when they confirmed she was a witch's descendant carrying forbidden magic. The second choice was to agree to stay in the palace under constant surveillance and work with Princess Alara until the child could speak in full sentences, proving that the curse could be broken and buying the crown time to figure out what to do with Ayanna afterward. Victor leaned against the doorframe and examined his nails. "Blood questioning is fatal for humans," he said. "The body cannot survive having memories ripped out like teeth. But working with the princess might buy you a few weeks, maybe a month. The king keeps you alive because you are useful. The moment you are not, you are meat." Ayanna's hands were shaking, but she kept her voice steady. "I will work with the princess." Victor's smile widened. "Smart girl." They moved her at dawn, not to a better cell, but to a room in the servants' wing with a narrow bed and a window that looked out on the courtyard where Ayanna could see the gallows standing empty in the gray light. A guard brought her clean clothes and a basin of water, and she washed the blood from her shoulders where the glass had cut her, and tried not to think about what came next. At midday, they took her to the glass conservatory, and Ayanna stopped breathing when she saw it. The room was a dome of mirrors and moonlight even in the daytime, walls lined with reflective glass that multiplied everything into infinity, and the ceiling was clear crystal that let in the pale sun filtered through clouds. In the center of the room sat Princess Alara on a velvet cushion, her white dress replaced with pale blue silk, her frost-colored hair braided with silver ribbons. She looked like a doll. She looked like a ghost. When she saw Ayanna, her whole face transformed, eyes going bright, and she started to stand, but a guard put a hand on her shoulder, and she froze. Ayanna crossed the room slowly, aware of the 4 guards at the exits, and the 5th one standing directly behind the princess, and she knelt in front of Alara, the way she had in the tower. The girl's hands flew to Ayanna's face, touching her cheeks, her hair, her lips, as if making sure she was real. Then Alara pointed to her own throat and opened her mouth in a silent question. Ayanna took the girl's hand and pressed it flat against her own neck so Alara could feel the vibration when she spoke. "We are going to teach you to talk. It will hurt. Things will break. But your voice is not a curse, baby. It is the truth trying to get out." Alara's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Ayanna glanced at the guards, and then at the curtain separating the conservatory from the adjacent room, and through the gap she could see a silhouette standing perfectly still. The king. Watching. She turned back to Alara and began. She taught her the simplest word first, the one her grandmother said was the foundation of all language: Mama. Ayanna pressed her palm to Alara's throat again and whispered the Yoruba phrase that unlocked something deep in the girl's chest, and then she shaped Alara's lips with her fingers and said it slowly. "Ma. Ma." Alara's mouth trembled. Her eyes went wide, and then she said it. "Mama." The sound was barely a whisper, cracked and unused, but it was there. And the nearest window exploded. Glass blew outward in a spray of glittering shards, and the guards jumped but didn't move from their posts, and Ayanna heard a sharp intake of breath from behind the curtain. Alara started crying, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. She said it again. Mama! Another window shattered. The guards tensed. Ayanna kept going. Over the next 3 nights they worked in 2-hour sessions, and each session Alara learned new words, and each word she spoke destroyed something in the room. The second night she learned alone, and when she said it, a mirror on the east wall cracked down the middle, the fracture spreading like a spider web. The third night she learned please, and the marble floor beneath them split with a sound like thunder, a fissure running from Alara's feet to the far wall. By the end of the third session, the glass conservatory looked like a mouth of broken teeth, jagged holes in the mirrors where Alara's voice had torn through, shattered glass covering the floor in drifts that crunched under Ayanna's boots. The guards never left their posts, but Ayanna could see the fear in their faces, the way they flinched every time Alara opened her mouth. And through it all, the king watched from behind the curtain, his silhouette never moving, never speaking. But once, after Alara said Mama for the 10th time and collapsed against Ayanna's chest, sobbing with exhaustion and joy, Ayanna heard a voice so low it might have been the wind. I am sorry. I am sorry I could not protect you from what we are. Ayanna looked up sharply, but the silhouette was gone. On the 4th morning, a different vampire came to her room. Not Victor, but a kitchen worker named Celeste with copper skin and kind eyes, and she brought Ayanna breakfast on a tray and sat on the edge of the bed while Ayanna ate. Celeste said she had worked in the palace for 60 years and remembered when the queen was still alive, when the halls were full of music and laughter instead of silence and dread. She said Queen Isadora was human, a duchess from the southern provinces who married King Constantine for love instead of politics, and the entire court had whispered that it was a mistake to mix bloodlines. When Isadora died in childbirth, and the baby was born without a voice, the court said it was proof that human blood corrupted the vampire line, that the curse was punishment for the king's arrogance in marrying beneath his station. But Celeste leaned close and lowered her voice to barely a whisper. That is a lie. The curse is older than the marriage. Vampire royals have been born without voices for 400 years, ever since King Constantine's ancestor betrayed the witches who served the crown. They just blamed it on the queen, because it was easier than admitting the truth. If Princess Alara speaks, if you prove a human can break the curse, it shatters the story they have been telling for 3 centuries. It proves the poison is in vampire blood, not human. And that secret could destroy alliances across 5 kingdoms. Ayanna felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a cloak made of lead. She asked what happened to the witches, and Celeste's face went hard. They were slaughtered, every single one. The king's ancestor wanted absolute power, and the witches refused to help him seize it, so he killed them in the courtyard and burned their books and tried to erase them from history. But curses do not die easy. They wait, they watch, and they find a way home. Celeste left, and Ayanna sat alone with the knowledge that she was not just teaching a child to speak, she was unraveling a lie that held a kingdom together. That night in the conservatory, Ilara clung to Ayanna's hand and whispered in her broken, halting voice, "Do not leave." The words came out jagged, consonants sharp enough to cut, and a crystal goblet on the windowsill exploded into powder. Ayanna smoothed the girl's hair back from her forehead and felt her heart crack because she knew she could not leave, even if they opened the doors and let her walk free. This child needed her, and that made her the most trapped she had ever been. King Constantine appeared in the conservatory doorway on the 5th night, and Ayanna saw him clearly for the first time. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair shot through with silver, a face carved from granite, and eyes the color of smoke. He wore black and crimson, and he moved through the wreckage of broken glass like he was walking through a garden. He stopped 3 feet from Ayanna and Alara, and his gaze went to his daughter first. Alara shrank back, and Constantine's expression flickered with something that might have been pain. Then he looked at Ayanna. "You are teaching her well." His voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. Ayanna lifted her chin. "She deserves to speak." Constantine circled them slowly, a predator evaluating prey. But his eyes kept returning to Alara with a hunger that was not about blood. It was grief. Raw and bleeding and 3 centuries old. He stopped behind Ayanna, and she felt the cold radiating from him, felt the terrible weight of his presence pressing down on her spine. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "If she speaks in full sentences, the court will demand to know how you did it. They will want your blood, your memories, your life." Ayanna kept her eyes on Alara. "Then I will give it." Constantine was silent for a long moment. Then he left, his footsteps echoing in the shattered room. The next morning, Victor returned with a contract written on parchment that smelled like copper and smoke, and he spread it on the table in Ayanna's room with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "This is a binding agreement. You will remain in the palace for the rest of your natural life, serving as the princess's tutor and companion. In exchange, the crown will cover all medical expenses for your brother, including the treatment he needs. If you refuse, the payments stop today." Ayanna stared at the document, at the words written in a language she barely recognized, at the line at the bottom waiting for her signature in blood. She thought about Malik. She thought about Alara's small hand in hers, the way the girl's face lit up every time she managed a new word. She thought about the witches who died in the courtyard, their voices silenced forever. And she picked up the quill and signed. The ink was still wet on the parchment when the door slammed open and King Constantine strode into the room like a storm-given form, and Victor went pale in a way Ayanna did not know vampires could. Constantine moved faster than her eyes could track, crossing the space between door and table in a heartbeat, and he snatched the contract from under her hand with enough force to tear the corner. Victor started to speak, but Constantine raised his other hand, and flame erupted from his palm, white-hot and contained. And he held the parchment in the fire until it curled and blackened and disintegrated into ash that floated through the air like snow. Victor took a step back, and his voice came out tight with fury barely controlled. "My lord, that contract was legally binding under blood law. The girl signed of her own free will." Constantine turned on him, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "You forged a contract without royal approval. You threatened a human under my protection. You tried to bind her with coercion, which invalidates the very clause you were attempting to exploit." Victor's jaw worked, but no sound came out, and Ayanna watched the 2 vampires face each other across the ruins of the document she had just sold her life for, and she understood with a sick clarity that she had walked into something much larger than a cleaning job, or even a curse. This was a war, and she was the territory they were fighting over. Constantine's voice was ice and iron. "Get out of my sight before I forget we are cousins." Victor left, his footsteps echoing in the hall, and the door closed with a sound like a coffin lid. Constantine stood with his back to Ayanna for a long moment, his shoulders rising and falling with breaths he did not need, and when he finally turned to face her, his expression was carved from exhaustion and something that might have been shame. He gestured to a chair. "Sit, please." The please surprised her. Ayanna sat because her legs were shaking and she did not trust them to hold her much longer. And Constantine moved to the window and looked out at the courtyard where torches were gathering, nobles in dark cloaks assembling like crows around a corpse. He spoke without looking at her. "Victor leads a faction of the court that believes the curse on vampire royalty is punishment for allowing human blood into our lineage. They have spent 3 centuries blaming my wife for Alara's silence, using it as proof that mixing bloodlines is an abomination. If Alara speaks, if you prove that a human can break the curse, it shatters their entire philosophy. It proves the curse is not about blood purity. It proves the poison is in us, not in the humans we marry. And that truth would destroy political alliances across 5 kingdoms. Alliances built on the lie that vampire blood is sacred and untainted. He turned from the window and his eyes met hers, and Ayanna saw grief there so old and deep it had worn grooves in his soul. Victor wants you dead because a dead witch's descendant cannot testify to the truth. But I want you alive because you are the only hope my daughter has ever had. I am declaring you Alara's official tutor under royal protection, which grants you legal immunity from the Court of Mirrors and binds you to the palace as a member of the household. You cannot be executed. You cannot be exiled. But you also cannot leave. Ayanna found her voice, though it came out raw. You are still making me a prisoner. Constantine's expression did not change. Yes, but an honored one. And alive. He crossed the room and pulled a second chair across from her and sat. And the act of a vampire king sitting in the presence of a human servant was so unprecedented that Ayanna's breath caught. Constantine leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and when he spoke again, his voice was stripped of all pretense. I need to tell you the truth about the curse. 400 years ago, my ancestor, King Aldrich, ruled this kingdom with the help of a coven of witches who had served the crown for generations. They were healers and seers, keepers of ancient magic, and they advised the throne on matters of blood and power. But Aldrich wanted absolute control. He demanded the witches perform a ritual that would make him immortal beyond the usual vampire lifespan, would give him power to command other vampires like puppets. The witches refused. They said such magic required sacrifices that would poison the land and destroy the balance between the living and the dead. Aldrich did not accept their refusal. He gathered his loyal soldiers and he slaughtered the entire coven in the courtyard at dawn. 13 witches, mothers and daughters and sisters. He burned their books and destroyed their altars and tried to erase them from history. But the eldest witch, the coven leader, lived just long enough to speak a final curse. She said vampire royalty would be born without voices until a daughter of the coven forgave the crown for the massacre. Not just forgave in words, but forgave in the soul. True forgiveness, freely given, or the curse would remain forever. Constantine's hands clenched into fists. For 4 centuries, every royal child born to this bloodline has been silent. Some died without ever making a sound. Some lived for centuries in voiceless agony. We searched for witch descendants, offered them gold and titles and power, but none of them could break the curse because none of them forgave us. Why would they? We murdered their ancestors. We tried to erase their existence. And then you walked into my palace to mop floors, and you touched my daughter, and you spoke words in a language I have not heard in 300 years. Your grandmother was Adayeze of the Crimson Coven, the last living descendant of the witches my ancestor slaughtered, and you carry the curse-breaking magic in your blood. Ayanna felt the room tilt. Her grandmother had never told her any of this, had never mentioned witches or curses or massacres, had only made her memorize a phrase and touched her throat and said, "Use this if you meet someone who cannot speak." She had thought it was a folk remedy, a superstition, not the key to breaking a 400-year-old curse. Constantine was still talking, his voice low and urgent. The curse is not broken yet. It is only paused. Alara can speak a few words because you helped her out of compassion, out of instinct, but the curse will not fully lift until you make a choice. You must forgive the crown for what was done to your bloodline. Forgive freely, without coercion, without payment. If you are forced or bribed or threatened into forgiveness, the curse will recognize the lie, and Alara will lose her voice forever, and you will die, because the curse will consume the magic in your blood as punishment for the deception. Ayanna stood up so fast the chair clattered backward. You want me to forgive a massacre? You want me to pretend centuries of blood and lies never happened? That my ancestors were not slaughtered like animals? Constantine stood as well, but he did not move closer. No, I want you to see my daughter as more than a symbol. I want you to decide if she deserves to speak, if she deserves a voice, Even though she carries the blood of the monster who killed your family, I cannot force you to forgive us. But I am begging you to save her." And then he did something Ayanna would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. King Constantine, ruler of 5 territories and lord of the Night Court, knelt on the stone floor in front of a human maid, his head bowed, his hands open and empty, his voice breaking when he spoke. "Please." Ayanna stared down at him and felt rage and grief warring in her chest, hot and cold, fire and ice. Her grandmother had died 10 years ago without telling her the truth, without explaining why she taught her those words. And now Ayanna was standing in a throne room at midnight with a vampire king on his knees, and the weight of 400 years pressing down on her shoulders. She thought about Alara's small hand in hers, the joy on the girl's face when she said her first word, the way she clung to Ayanna and whispered, "Do not leave." She thought about the 13 witches bleeding out in the courtyard, their voices silenced forever. She thought about the lie that had poisoned this kingdom for centuries, the lie that blamed human blood for a curse born from vampire cruelty. And movement in the doorway caught her eye, and she looked up to see Alara standing there in her white nightgown, her frost-colored hair loose around her shoulders, and the girl's hands were moving in frantic gestures. Sign language. "Do not cry." Ayanna had not realized she was crying until Alara pointed it out, tears streaming hot down her face, and she wiped them away with shaking hands. Constantine was still kneeling, still waiting, and through the window Ayanna could see the court of mirrors assembling in the courtyard, their torches flickering like fallen stars. She took a breath that hurt going down. "The curse is not broken yet." Constantine looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "It is paused, waiting for you to decide if we are worth mercy." Ayanna's voice came out hoarse. "I need time." Constantine rose slowly, his movements careful as if he were afraid of startling her. "Time is the one thing I cannot give you. The court convenes at dawn. They will demand answers. They will want to know how you broke the silence. Victor's faction will push for your execution, and I can protect you with the title of royal tutor, but I cannot stop them from asking questions. And if they discover the truth about the curse, about the forgiveness clause, they will try to force you or threaten you or manipulate you into giving false forgiveness, which will kill both you and Alara's chance at a voice." Ayanna looked at Alara again, at the child watching her with huge eyes full of trust and hope and fear, and she felt the trap close around her. Not a trap of walls and locks, but something worse. A trap of love, of responsibility, of the impossible choice between honoring the suffering of her ancestors and saving an innocent child. Constantine's voice was barely a whisper. "I know what I am asking. I know it is too much. But my daughter has been silent for 300 years, and you are the first person who ever heard her cry and came to help. That has to mean something." Ayanna closed her eyes and saw her grandmother's face, the way she had looked the day she taught Ayanna those words, the sadness in her eyes that Ayanna had been too young to understand. She opened her eyes and looked at Constantine. "Tell me what happens if I forgive. If I choose to forgive truly, from the soul, what happens to the curse?" Constantine's expression was carefully neutral. "Every vampire royal born in the last 400 years will gain their voice. The curse will break completely, across all bloodlines, all kingdoms. It will be undeniable proof that the curse was never about human blood contamination. It will shatter the political foundation of every alliance built on vampire purity. There will be chaos. There may be war. But my daughter will speak." Ayanna looked down at her hands, at the faint scars on her palms from years of scrubbing floors and washing dishes and trying to hold her family together. She thought about the contract she had signed, the one Constantine had burned to ash, and she realized he had not saved her from Victor's trap only to free her. He had saved her so she could walk into a different trap entirely, one built from moral weight instead of legal obligation. She met his eyes. "And if I do not forgive? If I refuse?" Constantine's face went gray. Then Alara will lose the few words she has gained. The curse will seal her voice again, tighter than before. And you will be free to leave the palace, free to return to your brother, free to live your life. I will not stop you. The court cannot touch you if you refuse to participate in breaking the curse. You are only in danger if you try to help. Ayanna understood then, with perfect clarity, that Constantine had given her the one thing Victor had tried to steal. A choice. A real choice, freely made, with no coercion except the weight of her own conscience. She could walk away. She could let Alara sink back into silence. She could honor her grandmother's suffering by refusing to forgive the crown that had slaughtered her family. Or she could choose to break the cycle, to stop the bleeding, to save a child who had done nothing wrong except be born into a cursed bloodline. The ash from the burned contract still floated in the air between them, and outside the window the torches in the courtyard burned brighter as more nobles arrived, and Alara took a hesitant step into the room and reached for Ayanna's hand. Ayanna took it. She looked at Constantine and saw a father, not a king. A man carrying 3 centuries of grief and guilt and desperate hope. She thought about forgiveness, what it meant, what it cost, and she realized her grandmother had known this moment would come, had prepared her for it, had given her the words and the power and the choice. Ayanna's voice was steady when she spoke. I need to think. I need to be alone. Constantine nodded and moved toward the door, then stopped. His shadow stretched across the floor, monstrous and broken at once. Thank you for not refusing outright. That is more than I deserve. He left, and Ayanna sank to the floor with Alara in her arms, and the little girl pressed her face against Ayanna's shoulder and whispered in her broken, halting voice, Stay, please stay. And Ayanna held her and watched the ash fall like snow, and knew she had already made her choice. Had made it the moment she climbed those tower stairs to answer a crying child. But she needed to understand it before she could speak it aloud. The grand hall was a cathedral built from mirrors and silver, every wall a sheet of polished glass that reflected the assembled court of mirrors in infinite repetition, creating a kaleidoscope of noble faces that stretched into impossible distance. And Ayanna stood in the center of it, surrounded by 1,000 versions of herself, all of them terrified. Dawn light filtered through the crystal dome overhead, pale and cold, and the assembled vampires sat in tiered rows like a jury built from nightmares, their eyes gleaming in the half-light. Constantine sat on his throne at the head of the hall, his face carved from stone, and beside him stood Victor in ceremonial robes of black and silver, his smile sharp enough to cut. Alara was not present. Constantine had forbidden it, said the child did not need to witness what came next, and Ayanna was grateful for that small mercy. Victor stepped forward, and his voice rang through the hall, amplified by some trick of acoustics or magic. We are gathered to pass judgment on the human called Ayanna Okafor, who stands accused of using forbidden magic to destabilize the crown and endanger Princess Alara. The evidence is clear. She entered the North Tower against explicit orders. She touched the princess without permission. She spoke words in a dead language that caused catastrophic damage to palace property. And most damning, she carries the blood of the Crimson Coven, the witches who cursed this kingdom 400 years ago. Her very presence here is an act of treason against vampire law. Murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles, and Ayanna saw the enchanted mirrors mounted on the side walls flickering with images of other courts, other kingdoms, all watching this trial broadcast live across the vampire world. Her stomach clenched. This was not just her judgment. This was theater. Victor continued, I call for immediate execution under the Blood Traitor Act of 1823, which states that any human carrying witch bloodline magic who enters a vampire household with intent to harm is subject to summary execution without trial. A voice cut through the murmurs, deep and cold. Constantine stood from his throne. The human acted with intent to help, not harm. She answered a child's cry for aid. That is not treason. Victor turned to face him, and Ayanna saw the gleam of triumph in his eyes. Then let her prove her intent. Let her submit to trial by testament, as is her right under ancient law. If her memories show pure intent, she goes free. If they show deception or malice, she dies. The hall went silent. Ayanna had no idea what trial by testament meant, but she saw the flash of fury on Constantine's face and knew it was bad. He spoke through gritted teeth. Trial by testament has not been invoked in 200 years. It is considered barbaric even by our standards. Victor's smile widened. But it is legal, and it is her only defense against the charges I have brought. Does she accept, or does she confess to witchcraft and accept execution now? Ayanna found her voice, thin and shaking. What is trial by testament? Constantine's eyes met hers, and she saw apology there, and dread. 3 nobles of the court's choosing will drink your blood and read your memories. They will see your thoughts, your intentions, your past. If 2 of the 3 confirm your intent was pure, you are declared innocent. It is excruciatingly painful for humans. The human body is not built to have memories extracted like teeth. Many do not survive. Ayanna tasted copper and salt, fear flooding her mouth. And if I refuse? Victor answered before Constantine could. Then you are declared guilty by default and executed within the hour. Ayanna looked around the hall at the hundreds of vampire faces watching her with cold curiosity, at the enchanted mirrors broadcasting her terror to kingdoms beyond counting, and she realized this was the trap she had been walking toward since the moment she touched Alara's throat. Not a trap built from contracts or coercion, but from the simple fact that she was human in a world built by monsters, and the only way to prove she was not a monster herself was to let them rip her open and look inside. She lifted her chin. I accept. The hall erupted in whispers, and Victor gestured to 3 nobles who stood from their seats and descended to the floor. The first was an elderly count with silver hair and empty eyes. The second was a baroness in crimson silk with a kind face that did not match the hunger in her gaze. The third was a viscountess, young and beautiful, with Victor's same sharp smile. Ayanna's heart sank. The fix was in. They brought her to a chair in the center of the hall, a throne built from black wood with restraints on the arms, and they strapped her wrists and ankles down, while Constantine watched from his throne, with his hands clenched so tight she could see his knuckles white from across the room. The count approached first. He knelt before her and took her left wrist in his cold hands, and when he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle. I will try to be quick. Then he bit down. The pain was instant and total, a white-hot spike that drove through her wrist and up her arm and into her spine. And Ayanna bit through her own lip to keep from screaming, tasting copper and salt. But worse than the pain was the sensation of something being pulled out of her, memories unwinding like thread from a spool, images flashing behind her eyes. Her grandmother on her deathbed, reaching for Ayanna's hand, whispering the truth about the witches and the curse with her last breath. Ayanna standing in the job office, signing the contract to work at the palace because Malik needed the treatment, and she would do anything, sell anything, become anything to save him. Climbing the tower stairs, because she heard a child crying, and she could not walk away from that sound, even if it killed her. The count released her wrist and stepped back, his eyes distant. Her intent was pure. She acted to help the child, not to harm the crown. 1 vote for innocence. The Baroness came next, and her bite was less gentle, teeth sinking deep, and Ayanna screamed this time, could not hold it back. More memories spilled out. Her childhood, her grandmother teaching her the words in Yoruba, the phrase that meant break the silence and set free the voice within. Her fear the first day at the palace, the way her hands shook when Margot handed her the rules. The moment she pressed her palm to Alara's throat and felt the magic sing through her blood, ancient and right. The Baroness pulled back and wiped blood from her lips. Her intent was pure. She carries magic, but she did not wield it with malice. 2 votes for innocence. The Viscountess approached, and Ayanna saw Victor nod to her, a tiny movement that most would miss. Ayanna tried to pull away, but the restraints held her fast, and the Viscountess smiled as she lowered her mouth to Ayanna's right wrist. The bite was agony, teeth sinking not just into flesh, but deeper, pulling not just memories but something else, something vital. Ayanna felt her heartbeat stutter, felt her vision blur, and through the haze of pain she heard the Viscountess laugh, ecstatic and cruel. Oh, the power in this one, it tastes like thunder. The Viscountess drank deeper, breaking protocol, trying to drain her completely, and Ayanna's scream turned to a choked gasp as her body started to shut down. Blood poured from her wrist, too much, pooling on the floor beneath the chair. The hall erupted in shouts, but Ayanna could not hear them over the roaring in her ears. Then Constantine was there, moving faster than her eyes could track, a blur of rage and motion. He grabbed the Viscountess by the throat and ripped her away from Ayanna with enough force to tear flesh, and the Viscountess hit the marble floor 3 feet away, blood on her mouth and shock in her eyes. Constantine's voice was a roar that shook the crystal dome. Enough! You broke covenant. You drank beyond measure. Get out of my sight before I tear you apart. The Viscountess scrambled backward and fled through the crowd, and Victor's expression flickered from triumph to fury. Constantine turned to Ayanna, and his hands were bloody when he touched her face, tilting her head up. Stay with me. Stay awake. But Ayanna's vision was graying at the edges, her body hemorrhaging from the wrist, and she felt herself sliding sideways out of the chair. The restraints released and she fell, but Constantine caught her before she hit the ground, lowering her gently to the marble. Blood pooled beneath her, spreading in a crimson lake, and she heard shouting, saw shapes moving above her, but it all felt distant and unimportant. Then a small figure broke through the crowd, guards trying to hold her back but failing. Alara. The princess ran across the hall in her white nightgown, her frost-colored hair flying behind her, and she dropped to her knees beside Ayanna and grabbed her hand. Ayanna tried to speak, but no sound came out. Alara's face was wet with tears, her mouth opening and closing, and Ayanna saw the girl gathering herself, saw the terror and determination warring in her eyes. Alara took a breath that shook her whole body, and she screamed, "Don't take her!" The words came out raw and whole, a full sentence for the first time in 300 years, and the sound was a physical force that hit the air like a shockwave. Every mirror in the grand hall shattered simultaneously, glass exploding outward in a wave of destruction that moved like dominoes falling in sequence. The enchanted mirrors broadcasting the trial went dark, their feeds cutting off one by one as they burst into fragments. The polished walls cracked and splintered, raining glass down on the assembled nobles who threw their arms up to shield their faces. Shards flew through the air in slow-motion chaos, catching the pale light and spinning like 1,000 tiny stars falling. Ayanna felt the sound in her bones, in her teeth, felt it reverberate through her chest and restart her stuttering heart. Alara collapsed against her, sobbing, cradling Ayanna's head in her small hands. Stay, stay, please stay. The hall was in chaos. Nobles bleeding from cuts, guards shouting, smoke rising from blown-out candles that had been knocked over in the destruction. And in the center of it all, Victor stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. This is what happens when you harbor a witch. This is the destruction she brings. King Constantine has chosen a human over his own kind, has put the entire kingdom at risk for a maid and a cursed child. He is unfit to rule. Victor drew a blade from his coat, silver and ancient, and a dozen nobles stood with him, forming a line across the hall. Constantine rose slowly, placing himself between Victor and Ayanna, and his voice was ice. "You dare draw steel in my hall?" Victor's smile was vicious. I dare claim what you have forfeited. You are weak, cousin. You let sentiment cloud your judgment. The Allied courts will thank me for removing you. What followed was brief and brutal. Constantine moved like lightning, disarming Victor in 3 moves. But Victor's loyalists surged forward, and suddenly the hall was full of violence, vampires moving too fast for human eyes, blades flashing, blood spraying across white marble. Constantine's guards flooded in from the side doors, loyalists who had been waiting for this moment, and they crashed into Victor's faction with the sound of metal on bone. Ayanna watched it through a haze of blood loss and shock. Alara pressed against her chest, both of them frozen in the center of the storm. She saw Constantine fight with the cold efficiency of someone who had been doing this for centuries, saw him break a noble's arm and throw another through a pillar. The fight lasted maybe 2 minutes. When it ended, Victor's faction was subdued, nobles pinned to the floor or fleeing through the exits, but Victor himself stood at the far end of the hall near one of the shattered mirror frames. He pressed his palm to the broken glass and it shimmered, rippled, became a portal. Constantine started toward him, but Victor was already stepping through, his voice echoing as he vanished. You chose a human over your own kind, Constantine. When the Allied courts hear this, your crown is ash. I will return with armies, and you will burn. The portal snapped shut, leaving only broken glass and silence. Constantine turned back to Ayanna, dropping to his knees beside her, and his hands were shaking when he pressed them to her wrist, trying to stop the bleeding. Healers flooded in with bandages and potions. Vampires with medical training who worked with inhuman speed, and Ayanna felt her consciousness slipping as they lifted her onto a stretcher. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Alara's face, tear-streaked and terrified, and the little girl's lips moving. She was speaking. Full sentences, whispered prayers, words tumbling out in a flood, now that the dam had broken. Mama would be proud of you. You are so brave. Please do not die. Please do not leave me. I love you. And Ayanna fell into the dark with those words ringing in her ears, wondering if this was what forgiveness felt like, or if it was just what dying felt like when you had finally found something worth dying for. Ayanna woke to silk sheets and firelight, and for a confused moment, she thought she was dead, because the ceiling above her was painted with stars in silver leaf, constellations she had never seen before, and the bed beneath her was softer than anything she had ever touched in her life. Then the pain hit, a dull throb in her right wrist that spread up her arm like fire in slow motion, and she gasped and tried to sit up. A hand pressed gently on her shoulder, keeping her down. Constantine's voice came from beside the bed, rough with exhaustion. Do not move yet. The healers said you need another day before the bone finishes knitting. Ayanna turned her head and saw him sitting in a chair pulled close to the bed, still wearing the blood-stained clothes from the trial, his face gray with fatigue. Behind him stretched a room she recognized from palace gossip, the king's private chambers, a space no human had entered in 200 years. Tapestries covered the walls, deep crimson and midnight blue, and a fire burned in a hearth carved from black marble. Through the tall windows she could see the palace gardens bathed in afternoon light. Her voice came out as a croak. How long was I unconscious? 3 days. You lost half your blood. The healers were not sure you would wake. Constantine leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and she saw the raw fear still lingering in his eyes. Alara has not left the door except to sleep. She sits in the hall and practices speaking to the guards. Full sentences now. She told the captain of the guard that if you died, she would scream until the entire palace collapsed. I believe she meant it. Ayanna felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. She is speaking well, then? Constantine's expression softened into something that might have been a smile if he remembered how. She is speaking constantly, asking questions about everything. She wanted to know why the sky is blue and where babies come from, and whether you would still love her if she accidentally broke your favorite cup. I did not have good answers for any of it. He stood and poured water from a crystal pitcher into a glass, held it to her lips while she drank. The intimacy of the gesture, a vampire king helping a human maid drink water, was so absurd she almost laughed. When she finished, he set the glass aside and sat again, and his hands were shaking. Ayanna noticed because she had never seen him uncertain before, never seen him show weakness, and it frightened her more than his rage had. Constantine spoke without meeting her eyes. I have been searching for a way to break the curse for 3 centuries. I consulted witches from every kingdom, offered fortunes and titles and blood oaths. Some lied and took my gold. Some tried the ritual and died in the attempt. Most told me the same thing, that the curse required forgiveness from a coven daughter, and forgiveness cannot be bought or forced. I stopped searching 50 years ago because I thought it was impossible, thought my daughter would live in silence forever, and it was my fault for being born into a bloodline of monsters. And then you walked through my door with a mop and a bucket, and you did in 5 minutes what I could not do in 300 years. His voice broke on the last word, and he pressed his palms to his eyes, and Ayanna realized he was crying. Vampire tears, slow and dark, like ink running down stone. She reached out with her good hand and touched his wrist. Constantine. He looked up, and the grief in his face was so naked she had to look away. Ayanna forced herself to ask the question she had been avoiding since he explained the curse. What happens if I forgive you? Does the curse break completely? Or just for Alara? Constantine was quiet for a long moment. I do not know. The original curse was vague, designed to torment. The eldest witch said vampire royalty would be born without voices until a daughter of the coven forgave the crown. But she did not specify if that meant one royal would be freed, or all of them. It might break the curse for every vampire royal born since the massacre, across all 5 kingdoms. Or it might only save Alara. We will not know until you make the choice. Ayanna felt the weight of it settle on her chest like a stone. She held the fate of an entire cursed bloodline in her hands. Dozens of silent vampire children scattered across kingdoms she had never seen, and she had no way to know if her forgiveness would save them or only the one child she had come to love. Constantine seemed to read her thoughts. I will not ask you to carry that weight. Whatever you decide, I will accept it. If you choose to forgive only for Alara, if you choose not to forgive at all, I will not force you. You have already given more than anyone had the right to ask. The door opened, and Alara slipped in, moving quietly despite her excitement, and when she saw Ayanna awake, she ran to the bed and climbed up carefully, mindful of the bandaged wrist. She wore a pale green dress and her hair was braided with ribbons. And when she spoke, her voice was small and clear and perfectly articulated. You are awake. I was so scared. I thought you were going to die and it would be my fault because I screamed and broke everything. Ayanna pulled the girl close with her good arm. You saved my life, baby. Your scream made my heart start again. Alara buried her face in Ayanna's shoulder and whispered, Why did they hurt your grandmother? Was she scared? Do you hate me? The questions hit like arrows, each one precise and devastating, and Ayanna had to take a breath before she could answer. They hurt my grandmother because she was powerful, and they were afraid of power they could not control. Yes, she was probably scared. And no, I do not hate you. You are not responsible for what your ancestors did. Alara pulled back and looked at her with eyes too old for a 7-year-old face. But you have to forgive them anyway, even though they do not deserve it. Ayanna smoothed the girl's hair back. I have to decide if I want to forgive them. There is a difference. Constantine stood and moved to the window, giving them space, and Ayanna watched his silhouette against the light and thought about choices and curses and the impossible math of mercy. That evening, a scout arrived with news that made Constantine's face go hard. Victor was returning in 3 days with princes from 2 allied kingdoms, armies marching under banners of silver and black, demanding Constantine abdicate or face war. They were calling the trial a farce, claiming Constantine had been bewitched by a human witch, that he was unfit to rule. Constantine assembled his own forces, loyal houses who believed in his leadership or at least feared him more than they feared Victor. He prepared defenses and sent messengers to neutral kingdoms asking for support, but he refused to pressure Ayanna for a decision, refused to use the coming war as leverage, and that restraint told her more about his character than any speech could. She spent the next 2 nights in the palace library, a vast room with shelves that climbed 3 stories high and ladders on rails to reach the upper levels. Constantine had retrieved her grandmother's journals from her childhood home, small leather-bound books filled with cramped handwriting in a mixture of English and Yoruba. Ayanna read them by candlelight, tears streaming down her face as she learned about the woman her grandmother had been before grief and exile had worn her down. Adayeze had been a healer and a teacher, beloved by the humans in the villages near the palace, respected even by some vampires. She had survived the massacre because she was away delivering a baby when the soldiers came, and she had spent the rest of her life carrying the guilt of survival and the burden of the curse she had inherited. In the final entry, written 3 days before she died, Adayeze had addressed Ayanna directly. "My sweet girl, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found your way to the palace as I knew you would. The curse draws coven daughters like a magnet, pulls us toward the place where our ancestors bled. You carry the power to break it, and you will have to choose whether to use that power or let it die with you. I cannot tell you what to choose. Forgiveness is not something that can be inherited or taught. It is a choice each person makes in the moment when they are asked to stop the bleeding or let it continue. All I can tell you is what I learned too late. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not pretending the harm never happened. It is choosing to stop the bleeding so the wound can finally heal. It is deciding that the next generation will not be born into the same cycle of violence and grief. I could not make that choice. I carried the anger until it consumed me. But you are stronger than I was. You have always been braver. Trust yourself." Ayanna closed the journal and sat in the silence of the library, surrounded by books written by people long dead, and she thought about cycles and choices and what it meant to be brave. On the third dawn, she found Constantine in the armory, preparing weapons for the coming fight, and she told him her decision. "I will forgive, but only in a public ritual where I can speak my grandmother's name and tell the truth of what was done. I will not let this be quiet or secret. If I am going to break a curse, everyone will know exactly what they did to deserve it." Constantine set down the sword he was sharpening and looked at her with something like awe. "When?" "Now. Before Victor arrives. Before anyone can stop us." They assembled in the courtyard at dawn, the same courtyard where the 13 witches had been executed 400 years ago. Constantine had ordered it transformed overnight. Lanterns hung from every tree, white flowers scattered across the stones, candles burning in glass holders that lined the walls. The bloodstains were still visible in the stone, dark patches that had never fully washed away, and Ayanna stood at the center of them wearing a white linen dress that Constantine said was traditional garb for the Crimson Coven. Her hands shook as he helped her into it, his fingers fumbling with the buttons, and she realized this was the first time she had seen him truly uncertain. Alara stood between them wearing a crown of white flowers, gripping both their hands, and she kept repeating, "It is okay, it is okay," like a mantra she was using to convince herself as much as them. The sky was turning from black to violet, dawn breaking over the palace walls, and Constantine had invited the remaining court of mirrors to witness the ritual because Ayanna had insisted it be public. Nobles gathered in the galleries above the courtyard, watching in silence. And the enchanted mirrors had been repaired enough to broadcast the event to other kingdoms. Ayanna stood at the center of the bloodstains and took a breath that hurt going down. She spoke in a voice that carried across the courtyard, amplified by the acoustics, or perhaps by the magic that was building in the air. "My name is Ayanna Okafor. My grandmother was a Daisy of the Crimson Coven, murdered here on this ground for refusing to bow to a tyrant's demand. I speak her name so you remember what you tried to erase. I speak the names of all 13 witches who died here. Adaeze, Kioma, Ngozi, Amara, Zuri, Ife, Ayo, Kemi, Ola, Dayo, Neka, Yetunde, Folami. They were healers and teachers and mothers and daughters, and they were slaughtered for the crime of saying no to a monster. As she spoke each name, a candle flared brighter, 13 candles arranged in a circle around her, and the air began to shimmer like heat waves rising from stone. Constantine stood outside the circle with his head bowed and his hands open, and Ayanna saw tears on his face. Elara stood beside him, watching with huge eyes, and when Ayanna looked at her, the girl mouthed the words, "I love you." Ayanna continued, "For 400 years, vampire royalty has been born without voices as punishment for that massacre. Innocent children have suffered for crimes committed by ancestors they never knew. And now I am asked to forgive, to break the cycle, to stop the bleeding." She paused, gathering herself, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady. "I am not doing this because I think your family deserves it. I am doing it because my daughter should not pay for your debts." Constantine looked up sharply at the word daughter, and Ayanna saw understanding dawn in his eyes. She had claimed Elara publicly, shifted from servant to mother, created a bond that could not be commanded or bought. Ayanna turned to face the bloodstains beneath her feet and knelt, pressing her palms to the dark stone. She spoke the words her grandmother had taught her, the Yoruba phrase that meant break the silence and set free the voice within. But she added words of her own. "I forgive the crown for the massacre of the Crimson Coven. I forgive in the name of Adaeze and her sisters. I forgive not because the harm was small, but because the next generation deserves to be free of it. I forgive so the bleeding stops here." The air cracked like thunder. The bloodstains beneath her hands began to glow, silver light rising from the stone, spreading outward in veins that traced the pattern of old violence. The light grew brighter, warmer, and Ayanna felt power surge through her, ancient magic that had been sleeping in her blood for generations, waking all at once. The courtyard filled with silver light so bright the nobles in the galleries had to shield their eyes. And then the bloodstains faded, slowly at first, then faster, the dark patches dissolving into clean stone as if the violence had never happened. The light spread across the entire courtyard, cleansing centuries of grief in seconds, and when it finally dimmed, the stones were white and unmarked. Ayanna stayed kneeling, gasping for breath, and Constantine was there in an instant, helping her up, his hands shaking. "Did it work? Do you feel different?" Ayanna shook her head. "I do not know. We will not know until we hear from the other kingdoms, until we find out if their silent royals can speak now." Elara ran to her and wrapped her arms around Ayanna's waist, burying her face against her stomach. "Thank you. Thank you for saving me." That was when the gates exploded. Victor's army poured through, soldiers in black armor flooding the courtyard, and Victor himself rode at the front on a midnight horse, his face twisted with rage. "Stop this heresy! She is manipulating the king with witchcraft!" But his voice faltered when he saw the three of them standing together in the dawn light. Ayanna in white linen with silver light still clinging to her skin, Constantine with his hand on her shoulder, Elara between them holding both their hands. The cleansed courtyard, the transformed space. Victor's expression flickered from rage to fear. Ayanna stepped forward, her voice ringing across the courtyard. "My name is Ayanna Okafor. My grandmother was Adaeze of the Crimson Coven, murdered here on this ground for refusing to bow. I speak her name so you remember what you tried to erase. And I forgive, not because you have earned it, but because my daughter should not pay for your debts." The army halted at the gates, uncertain, and Ayanna saw confusion ripple through the ranks. Behind Victor, one of the allied princes dismounted and approached slowly, his face pale. He spoke in a voice thick with shock. My son just spoke. For the first time in 60 years he spoke. He said my name. Another noble stepped forward. My niece. She is speaking in full sentences, calling for her mother. The curse is broken. Victor's face went white, then red, and he drew his sword. This changes nothing. The witch must die for violating blood law. But before he could move, Constantine stepped in front of Ayanna, his own blade drawn, and his voice was colder than winter stone. You will have to go through me first, cousin, and I have been waiting 300 years for an excuse to remove you from my court. Victor looked around at his army, at the nobles who had followed him expecting victory, and saw doubt spreading through their ranks like plague. The curse was broken. The silent children across 5 kingdoms were speaking. Ayanna had done what centuries of kings and sorcerers could not. Victor's claim that she was manipulating Constantine with witchcraft crumbled in the face of that undeniable miracle. He lowered his sword slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was poison. This is not over. You have made an enemy of every kingdom that built their laws on vampire purity. They will come for you, all of you, and when they do, I will be leading the charge. He turned his horse and rode back through the gates, his army following, and Ayanna watched him go with a sick certainty that he was right. She had broken the curse, but she had also shattered the lie that held vampire society together, and lies that old do not die quietly. Constantine sheathed his sword and turned to her, and his expression was complicated, gratitude and fear and something deeper. You just started a war. Ayanna looked down at Alara, at the little girl who was smiling up at her with joy so pure it hurt to witness. I know, and that is why it will work. The psychic shockwave hit at the exact moment the bloodstains faded from the courtyard stones. A pulse of silver light that rippled outward from Ayanna like a stone dropped in still water, spreading across the palace grounds and beyond, racing through the vampire kingdoms faster than sound or sight. In the northern territories, a princess who had been silent for 200 years sat up in her bed and said her first word, Mother, and the queen who had given up hope 3 lifetimes ago fell to her knees weeping. In the eastern provinces, a young prince at a formal dinner suddenly laughed at a joke he had only been able to hear before, and the sound was so unexpected that every vampire at the table froze with their goblets halfway to their mouths. In the southern coast kingdoms, twin royal children began singing together, their voices high and clear, harmonizing on a lullaby their nursemaid had hummed to them for 60 years. Across 5 kingdoms and a dozen royal bloodlines, voices that had been locked away for centuries suddenly broke free, and the sound of it was like bells ringing across the world. Victor's allied princes felt it first because they were standing in the courtyard when it happened, saw the silver light wash over them, and one of them, a duke from the western mountains, grabbed Victor's arm with a grip that would have broken human bone. My son just spoke. I heard it in my mind, heard his voice for the first time in 60 years. He said my name. The second prince, younger and angrier, rounded on Victor with fury in his eyes. You told us the human was using dark magic to control King Constantine. You said she was destabilizing the crown. But she just broke a curse that has tormented our families for 400 years. You lied to us. Victor tried to speak, tried to salvage the situation, but the nobles who had followed him were already backing away, their faith in his leadership crumbling like sand. A viscountess who had lost 3 children to the curse stepped forward, and her voice was cold as winter stone. Arrest him. He has wasted our time and resources on a vendetta, while this human girl accomplished what centuries of kings could not. Victor's own men seized him, and he did not resist because resistance would mean execution, and surrender might mean exile, and exile was better than death. They dragged him from the courtyard, and Ayanna watched him go, feeling nothing but exhaustion, the adrenaline that had carried her through the ritual draining away all at once. Constantine caught her when her knees buckled, his arm around her waist, and he half-carried her to a bench near the fountain while Alara ran to get water. The nobles who remained in the courtyard stood in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed, and then slowly, one by one, they began to kneel. It started with an elderly count who had served the crown for 3 centuries, then spread through the crowd like a wave, vampires dropping to one knee with their heads bowed in a gesture of respect Ayanna had only seen them give to royalty. Constantine helped her sit and knelt beside her, his voice low. They are acknowledging what you have done. You have given voice to an entire generation of cursed children. You have broken a cycle of suffering that predates most of them. They will want to honor you for it. Ayanna looked out at the sea of kneeling vampires and felt panic rising in her throat. I do not want honor. I just wanted to help Alara. Constantine's hand found hers and squeezed gently. I know, but you cannot control what this moment means to others. You have become something larger than yourself. The Court of Mirrors convened 3 days later in an emergency session, and this time the atmosphere was completely different from the trial. The nobles gathered in the rebuilt Grand Hall, where workers had replaced the shattered mirrors with clear glass and hung tapestries to soften the echoes. And when Ayanna entered with Alara at her side, the entire assembly stood. The head of the council, a duchess with silver hair and kind eyes, read from a scroll in formal language that made Ayanna's head spin. But the essence was clear. They were naming her Mother of Voices, a title that had not existed before, but would now be permanent, granting her a seat on the council and protection under blood law. No vampire could harm her without facing immediate execution. No court could prosecute her without the council's unanimous consent. She was untouchable. She was also trapped. The Duchess explained the terms carefully. The protection only extended within vampire territory, within the palace grounds and the capital city. If Ayanna left to return to the human kingdoms, she would lose the title's protection and become vulnerable to any noble who still harbored resentment about the curse breaking. And there were many who did, nobles whose entire political philosophy had been built on the lie of vampire purity, who now found themselves on the wrong side of history. Ayanna felt the walls closing in as she realized what this meant. Malik was in a hospital in the human kingdom, 2 weeks' travel away, and she could not go to him without risking assassination. She had saved Alara, but lost her brother. The thought made her want to scream. Constantine must have seen it on her face because he requested a private audience after the council session. And when they were alone in his study, he poured her a glass of wine she could not drink and told her his solution. I will send my best healers to your brother. Vampire healers who can do things human medicine cannot. And when he is well enough to travel, I will have him brought here to the capital, to a residence near the palace where you can visit him daily. He will have the best care, the best tutors if he wants education, the best of everything, if you consent to stay. Ayanna stared at him, looking for the trap, the hidden cost. And what do you want in return? Constantine met her eyes without flinching. For you to raise Alara, to teach her to be strong and kind and brave like you, to help her navigate a world that will expect her to be a symbol when she is just a child. I cannot do that alone. I have spent 300 years being a king, and I have forgotten how to be a father. You gave her a voice. I am asking you to help her learn how to use it. Ayanna thought about it for a long moment, weighing her options, and realized she had already made this choice the moment she climbed the tower stairs. I will stay, but on one condition. Alara learns both languages, human and vampire. She is raised to know both worlds, not just this one. She learns that power is not the same as worth, and that the people who serve her are not lesser than her. She learns what her family did to mine, the truth of it, not some sanitized version. And when she is old enough to choose, she gets to decide what kind of ruler she wants to be. Constantine's expression softened into something that might have been relief or gratitude or both. Agreed. 3 months passed in a blur of healing and adjustment. Malik arrived at the capital looking healthier than Ayanna had seen him in years. the vampire healers having worked small miracles on his condition, and he moved into a comfortable house near the palace where Ayanna visited him every afternoon. He was fascinated by the vampires and terrified of them in equal measure, but Alara won him over by teaching him card games and asking him endless questions about human schools and whether he had ever seen the ocean. The palace settled into a new rhythm, Ayanna's presence no longer scandalous but accepted, and she found herself attending council meetings where nobles debated trade agreements and border disputes, her vote carrying the same weight as any duke or duchess. It was surreal and exhausting, and sometimes she missed the simplicity of mopping floors, but then Alara would run up to her chattering about something she had learned or seen, and Ayanna would remember why she stayed. The glass conservatory had been transformed into something beautiful. Where mirrors had once lined the walls, now thick vines crawled upward, dotted with luminescent white flowers that only bloomed at night, their petals glowing softly in the darkness. The air smelled like jasmine and rain, and the glass dome overhead let in moonlight that no longer fragmented through shattered surfaces, but poured down whole and silver. Ayanna walked through it on a quiet evening with Alara skipping ahead, the girl's voice echoing off the glass as she narrated her own adventure. I am a brave explorer discovering a magical garden, and I have to find the secret treasure before the dragon wakes up. Do you think there are dragons in here? Ayanna smiled despite her exhaustion. I think if there were dragons, they would be very small and very friendly. Alara ran to the fountain at the center of the conservatory and leaned over the edge, shouting into the water. Hello, hello, I want to hear my voice echo. The sound bounced back, layered and strange, and Alara dissolved into giggles. Come on, I want to hear my voice echo. Ayanna followed more slowly, because she was still human and could not match a vampire child's endless energy. Slow down, baby. I cannot run that fast. A voice came from the doorway, warm and quiet. She has not stopped talking since the curse broke. I think she is making up for 300 years of silence all at once. Ayanna turned to see Constantine leaning against the frame, watching them with an expression she had never seen on his face before. He was smiling. Not the cold diplomatic smile he used in council meetings, but something genuine and unguarded, and it transformed his entire face. He looked younger, less burdened, almost human. He walked toward them and knelt beside the fountain to watch Alara splash her hands in the water, and when he spoke, his voice was soft. Thank you for giving me my daughter back. Ayanna felt something warm bloom in her chest, something dangerous and complicated that she was not ready to name. I did not give her to you, I gave her to herself. Constantine looked up at her and something passed between them, understanding or recognition, or the beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. Alara broke the moment by splashing water at both of them and demanding they tell her a story about the old days before the curse, and they sat together on the edge of the fountain while Constantine told sanitized tales of court life and Alara asked increasingly difficult questions about why people did cruel things and whether anyone was truly evil or just scared. Ayanna listened and watched the moonlight filter through the glass dome and thought about how strange her life had become, how she had walked into this palace expecting to mop floors for a year, and instead had become mother of voices, breaker of curses, the woman who held a vampire king's gratitude and a princess's love. It felt fragile, this happiness, like glass that could shatter at any moment. When Alara finally tired and curled up against Ayanna's side, half asleep, Constantine carried her back to her chambers, and Ayanna walked slowly through the conservatory alone, breathing in the jasmine-scented air and trying to memorize this moment of peace. As she turned toward the exit, something slipped from her pocket. A letter. She had not noticed it there, had not received any mail today, but it fell to the marble floor with a soft sound and landed face up. The seal was crimson wax pressed with the image of a raven, wings spread, and beneath it 3 words written in handwriting she recognized from her grandmother's journals. They are coming. Ayanna's blood went cold. She bent to pick it up, but a shadow fell across it first. Constantine had returned, and his eyes were fixed on the letter, and the smile had vanished from his face. "Where did you get this?" Ayanna's voice came out thin and shaking. "I do not know. It was just in my pocket. I did not put it there." Constantine picked up the letter carefully, as if it might explode, and turned it over. The back was blank except for a small symbol drawn in the corner, a circle with 13 points radiating outward, a coven mark. His expression went from concerned to grim. "We need to talk to the council. Now." But Ayanna was staring at the words, at her grandmother's handwriting spelling out a warning from beyond the grave, and she felt the fragile peace of the last 3 months crack like ice under pressure. She had broken one curse, freed the silent children, started a new life in this strange palace. But her grandmother had known something she had not shared, had left a warning hidden in a way that would only appear when Ayanna had accomplished her task. "They are coming." Who? Witches angry that she had forgiven the crown? Vampires who wanted the curse restored? Enemies her grandmother had made that Ayanna knew nothing about? Constantine's hand found her shoulder, steady and warm. "We will figure this out. Whatever is coming, we will face it together." Ayanna looked up at him and saw determination in his eyes. And behind him through the doorway, she could see Alara's light still burning in her chambers. The girl probably reading in bed or talking to her dolls, practicing her voice. She thought about the choice she had made 3 months ago to forgive and break the cycle. And she realized with a sick clarity that breaking cycles did not mean the story was over. It just meant the next chapter could finally begin. She nodded slowly and let Constantine lead her from the conservatory, the letter clutched in her hand, the crimson raven seal catching the moonlight. Behind them, the white flowers continued to bloom in the darkness, their glow soft and constant, and the fountain kept flowing, water over stone, endless and patient. The glass conservatory stood transformed, no longer a place of shattered mirrors and broken silence, but a garden of new growth. And outside its walls, the vampire kingdoms celebrated their freed children, while somewhere in the shadows, something ancient and patient prepared to move. The curse was broken. The voices were free. But the story, Ayanna understood now, was far from over. It was only just beginning.